A quiet island in the dark. Good evening. Tonight, there is nowhere to go, nothing to solve, and nothing to worry about. For the next little while, you are invited to leave behind the noise of the day and travel to a quiet island on the far northeastern coast of America. An island so small that it does not appear on many maps. A place where the ocean moves at its own slow pace. A place where time seems to stretch gently, like the long shadows of evening. Far from busy cities, far from crowded roads, and far from the glow of bright lights, there stands an old lighthouse. The lighthouse has watched over the sea for many decades. Its white walls have been painted many times. Its windows have faced countless storms. Its lantern has guided ships through fog, rain, and darkness. And inside that lighthouse lives a man. His name is Thomas Hale. He is not famous. No books have been written about him. No statues have been built in his honor. Most people have never heard his name. And yet, for nearly 40 years, he has quietly cared for the lighthouse. Every day, every season, every year. Thomas lives alone, not because he dislikes people, but because he has grown comfortable with silence. The silence of the sea, the silence of distant clouds, the silence that arrives just before dawn. Tonight, as our story begins, the island is asleep. The sky is dark. The stars are scattered across the heavens like tiny silver lights. The ocean is calm. Gentle waves rise and fall against the rocks below. The sound is soft, steady, predictable, a rhythm older than memory. The morning lantern inspection. The first light of morning slowly spread across the ocean. Thomas stood quietly by the window. For a few moments, he simply watched the horizon. The sea was calm today. Small waves rolled gently toward the shore. The sky carried soft shades of silver, blue, and pale gold. Everything felt peaceful. Everything felt familiar. And Thomas liked familiar things. After nearly 40 years in the lighthouse, he had learned that comfort often lived inside simple routines. Every morning began the same way, slowly, patiently, without hurry. He put on his thick wool sweater. The sweater had been repaired many times over the years. Small stitches could be seen on the sleeves, but it remained warm, reliable, comfortable. Just like many things on the island. The wooden staircase curved upward toward the lantern room. Thomas began climbing, one step at a time. The lighthouse was quiet, except for the gentle sound of his footsteps. Upward he went, past old photographs, past shelves of supplies, past windows overlooking the ocean. Finally, he reached the lantern room. The room sat at the very top of the lighthouse. Large glass panels surrounded him. From here, he could see the sea in every direction. The morning sunlight sparkled across the water. Thousands of tiny reflections danced on the waves. The lantern stood proudly in the center of the room. Although modern navigation had reduced its importance, Thomas still cared for it every day. He believed that some traditions deserved respect, even when they were no longer necessary. He carefully inspected the glass panels. No cracks, no damage, no problems. Then he took a soft cloth from a nearby cabinet. Slowly, he began cleaning the glass. Every movement was gentle. Every motion was unhurried. The cloth moved across the smooth surface. The glass became clearer, brighter, cleaner. Outside, a few seabirds drifted across the morning sky. Thomas paused to watch them. They moved effortlessly, riding invisible currents of air, floating above the ocean. Their wings barely moved. The sight always brought him a sense of peace. For many years, the birds had been part of his mornings, just as the sea had been, just as the lighthouse had been. Time passed quietly. The lantern inspection continued. Nothing unusual happened, and that was exactly how Thomas preferred it. Ordinary mornings were often the best mornings. The lantern gleamed softly in the growing sunlight. Satisfied with his work, Thomas placed the cloth back into the cabinet. He looked out across the endless ocean one last time. The day was only beginning, and already it felt like a good day. Walking the cliff path. With the lantern inspection complete, Thomas stepped outside. The morning air felt cool and fresh. A gentle breeze moved across the island. The scent of salt drifted through the air, the familiar smell of the sea. Thomas took a slow breath, then another. The island was beginning to wake, not with noise, not with activity, but with quiet movement. The grass swayed gently. Small waves touched the shoreline. A distant seabird called across the water. Thomas followed the narrow path that wound along the cliffs. He had walked this path thousands of times. Every stone was familiar. Every curve of the trail was known to him. The path followed the coastline. Far below, the ocean moved steadily against the rocks. White foam appeared briefly before fading back into the sea. Again and again, the same pattern, the same rhythm, the same peaceful repetition. Thomas enjoyed these walks. They allowed him to observe small changes, a new flower blooming, a patch of grass growing taller, a different group of birds resting on the rocks. Simple details, small details, the kinds of things many people never notice. But on the island, such things mattered. The world moved slowly here, and because it moved slowly, small changes became easier to see. Clouds drifted across the sky. Their shadows moved across the ocean. The sunlight sparkled where the water remained clear. The breeze carried a gentle chill. Nothing demanded attention. Nothing interrupted the calm. Thomas continued walking, one slow step after another. The path stretched ahead, the sea stretched beyond it, and the morning unfolded peacefully around him. The seabirds of morning. As Thomas continued along the cliff path, he noticed the familiar gathering of seabirds near the western rocks. They had arrived early today. Dozens of white birds rested quietly above the shoreline. Some stood motionless. Others gently preened their feathers. The birds seemed completely at ease. Thomas stopped for a moment to watch them. He had spent many years observing these visitors. Their habits rarely changed. Their routines felt as dependable as the tides. The ocean breeze moved softly through their feathers. A few birds lifted into the air. Their wings opened wide. For several moments, they simply glided above the water. No rushing, no struggle, only smooth movement carried by the wind. Thomas always admired this. The birds seemed to understand something important. They never hurried. They trusted the currents. They trusted the wind. And somehow they always found their way. The morning sun climbed higher. Golden light touched the surface of the sea. The birds became bright white against the blue horizon. Thomas remained quietly where he stood, watching, listening, breathing, enjoying another ordinary island morning. Breakfast above the ocean. After completing his morning walk, Thomas returned to the lighthouse. The familiar wooden door closed softly behind him. Inside, everything felt warm and comfortable. The small kitchen overlooked the sea. A single window framed the ocean like a painting. Thomas prepared a simple breakfast: fresh bread, a little butter, hot tea. Nothing complicated, nothing unusual. He preferred simple meals. The kettle released gentle steam. The scent of tea filled the room. Outside, the ocean continued its endless movement, wave after wave, hour after hour, year after year. Thomas carried his breakfast to the table beside the window. Slowly, he sat down. The chair creaked softly beneath him. He wrapped his hands around the warm cup. The heat felt comforting against the cool morning air. For a long moment, he simply watched the sea. The horizon stretched endlessly into the distance. Clouds drifted lazily above the water. A fishing boat appeared far away, small enough to be mistaken for a dot. Thomas smiled. He wondered where the boat was headed. Then he took another sip of tea and continued enjoying the peaceful morning. The Lighthouse Logbook. After breakfast, Thomas climbed the narrow staircase once again. The lighthouse was quiet. Only the distant sound of the ocean could be heard. Step
by step, he reached a small room just below the lantern chamber. Inside stood an old wooden desk. The desk had served many lighthouse keepers before him. Its surface carried tiny scratches gathered across decades. Beside the desk rested a large leather-bound logbook. The logbook was old. Very old. Its pages held thousands of entries. Weather reports, ocean conditions, passing ships, daily observation.
Small moments carefully recorded through the years. Thomas gently opened the book. The familiar scent of aged paper filled the room. He picked up a fountain pen. Outside the window, sunlight reflected across the sea. The waves rolled steadily toward shore. Everything appeared calm today. Thomas began writing. Date. Weather conditions. Wind direction. Visibility. Ocean state. Each detail was carefully recorded. There was no rush. The words appeared slowly across the page. Line after line. Entry after entry. For nearly 40 years, this had been part of his routine. A quiet conversation between himself and time. When future generations might one day read these pages, they would discover something simple. That life on the island moved peacefully. One day at a time. One season at a time. 1 year at a time. Thomas finished writing. He carefully closed the book. Outside, the ocean continued its endless rhythm, just as it always had. The fishing boat on the horizon. As the morning slowly drifted toward afternoon, Thomas noticed a small fishing boat far out at sea. It appeared as a tiny shape against the horizon, barely visible, yet unmistakable. The boat moved steadily through the water, neither fast nor slow, simply following its course. Thomas often enjoyed watching the boats. Each one seemed to tell a silent story. Some traveled north, others headed south. Some departed before sunrise, others returned at sunset. The ocean connected countless lives. People living in distant towns, families gathered near harbors, fishermen beginning another ordinary day. From the lighthouse, Thomas could only imagine their journeys. The boat continued forward. A thin trail formed behind it. Soon, the vessel became smaller and smaller still, until it blended with the distant horizon. Thomas remained by the window, watching the empty stretch of sea. There was something comforting about knowing life continued beyond the island, even while the lighthouse stood quietly in its familiar place. The waves rolled onward, the clouds drifted overhead, and somewhere beyond the horizon, the fishing boat continued its peaceful voyage. Afternoon among the wildflowers. The afternoon sun rested high above the island. A gentle warmth spread across the grass. Thomas followed a familiar path toward the southern side of the island. Here, wildflowers grew freely. Yellow flowers, white flowers, purple flowers. Small patches of color scattered across the landscape. The breeze moved gently among them, creating slow waves of motion. Thomas paused beside one of the flower fields. For a few moments, he simply watched. The flowers swayed quietly. The ocean shimmered beyond them, and the island continued its peaceful afternoon.
Afternoon among the wildflowers. Thomas slowly continued along the flower-covered path. The island was not large, yet every season brought new colors. The flowers changed from month to month. Some appeared only briefly. Others remained throughout the summer. Thomas had come to know many of them over the years. Not by scientific names, but by familiarity. The same yellow flowers that appeared every June. The same purple blossoms that arrived with the warmest days of summer. The same tiny white flowers that grew nearest the cliffs. The breeze carried a soft fragrance. Fresh grass. Wildflowers. Salt from the sea. Everything blended together into a scent that belonged only to the island. Above him,
The old wooden bench. Near the eastern side of the island stood an old wooden bench. The bench had been there for many years. No one remembered exactly when it was built. Perhaps decades ago. Perhaps even longer. The ocean air had weathered the wood. The color had faded. The edges had softened. Yet the bench remained strong, reliable, steady. Much like the lighthouse itself. Thomas approached slowly, then sat down. The wood creaked gently beneath him. Before him stretched the open sea. The afternoon sun reflected across the water. Thousands of tiny points of light sparkled upon the waves. The sight never became ordinary, even after all these years. Thomas leaned back comfortably. A gentle breeze crossed the island. The grass moved softly. The clouds continued their slow journey. Time seemed to move differently here.
slower, softer, more patiently. The bench offered a perfect place to observe these.
A gentle summer rain. As evening slowly approached, clouds gathered above the island. Nothing severe, nothing threatening. Only soft gray clouds arriving from the horizon. Thomas noticed them immediately. Years beside the ocean had taught him to read the sky. The first raindrops arrived quietly. Small drops touched the lighthouse windows. Then another. And another. Soon a gentle summer rain spread across the island. The sound was soothing. Rain tapped softly against the glass. The ocean continued its steady rhythm below. Together, they created a peaceful harmony. Thomas stood near the window, watching the rain move across the sea. The distant horizon became slightly blurred. The colors softened. Blue became gray. Silver became mist. The island seemed even quieter now. The rain encouraged stillness. It encouraged rest. For nearly an hour, the gentle shower continued. No thunder, no strong wind, only calm rain, and the comforting sound of water meeting earth and sea. Thomas watched peacefully. The keeper's small garden. The gentle summer rain had passed. The clouds slowly drifted toward the eastern horizon. Little by little, warm afternoon sunlight returned to the island. Tiny drops of rain still rested upon the grass. Each one reflected the golden light like a tiny piece of glass. Thomas opened the lighthouse door. The cool air greeted him softly. He paused for a quiet moment. The island always seemed different after a rainfall. The colors became deeper. The air became fresher. The ocean carried a cleaner scent. Somewhere nearby, a single seabird called across the cliffs. Its voice faded gently into the distance. Thomas smiled. He knew it would soon become quiet again. Not far from the lighthouse stood a small wooden fence. Behind it was a garden. It was not a large garden. It did not need to be. Just a few neat rows of vegetables. Several patches of herbs. A handful of colorful flowers.
Enough to brighten the island. Enough to give Thomas something peaceful to care for. He picked up an old watering can. Although the rain had already watered most of the plants, Thomas still liked checking each one. He believed that careful attention mattered. He slowly walked between the rows. The tomato plants looked healthy. Tiny green tomatoes had begun to appear. Nearby, fresh basil gently moved in the breeze. Its pleasant fragrance mixed with the salty ocean air. Small purple lavender flowers swayed quietly. Bees moved lazily from flower to flower, never in a hurry, always following their own peaceful rhythm. Thomas carefully removed a single fallen leaf from one of the plants, then another. He gently straightened a wooden support beside a growing vine. Small tasks, simple tasks, yet each one brought quiet satisfaction. Above him, the sky had become bright blue once again. Soft white clouds floated peacefully overhead. The lighthouse stood silently nearby, watching over the island, watching over the sea, watching over Thomas. A gentle breeze passed through the garden. The leaves whispered softly. The flowers nodded with the wind. Nothing needed to happen. Nothing exciting interrupted the afternoon. Only quiet work, gentle movement, simple moments. Thomas filled the watering can once more. This time, he watered the flowers nearest the lighthouse door. Drops of water sparkled briefly in the sunlight before disappearing into the rich soil. He watched the flowers for several moments. Their bright colors reminded him that beauty often arrived quietly, without asking for attention, without making noise, simply existing. The afternoon sun slowly began its journey lower across the sky. Long shadows stretched across the garden. The golden light became softer, warmer, more peaceful. Thomas placed the watering can beside the fence. He looked once more across his little garden. Everything appeared healthy. Everything appeared calm. The vegetables continued growing. The flowers continued blooming. The herbs continued filling the air with gentle fragrance, just as they had yesterday, just as they would tomorrow. Thomas quietly closed the small wooden gate. Behind him, the lighthouse waited patiently. Ahead of him, the ocean shimmered beneath the afternoon sun. Another peaceful hour had gently passed on the island, and once again, the simple routines of the day had brought a quiet sense of contentment.
Watching the clouds. The afternoon slowly drifted toward evening. The warmth of the day softened with every passing minute. Thomas walked beyond the small garden and followed a narrow path leading toward the northern cliffs. This was one of his favorite places on the island. Not because it was higher, not because it offered the widest view, but because it always seemed to welcome the sky. Above him, clouds floated quietly across the blue horizon. Some were long and thin. Others were soft and round. each one moved with gentle patience. Thomas had often wondered how many thousands of clouds he had watched during his years on the island. Too many to count. Yet each afternoon felt new. Each sky carried its own quiet beauty. He stopped near the edge of the cliff. The ocean stretched endlessly below. The waves reflected the changing light of the afternoon. Blue slowly mixed with silver. Silver slowly turned to soft gold. The breeze carried the scent of salt and wild grass. It brushed gently against his sweater. His gray hair moved slightly with the wind. For several long moments, Thomas simply looked upward. The clouds never hurried. They traveled wherever the wind wished to take them. Some slowly joined together.
Others quietly drifted apart. There was no destination, no urgency, only movement. Slow, peaceful, natural. Thomas found comfort in watching them. The clouds reminded him that not everything needed to be controlled. Some things were meant to drift. Some things were meant to change. And some things were simply meant to be observed. Far below, gentle waves continued touching the rocks. A distant seabird crossed beneath the clouds. Its white wings reflected the golden afternoon light. The island remained wonderfully quiet. There were no engines, no traffic, no voices. Only wind, only water, only sky. Thomas took a slow breath, then another. He watched one large cloud slowly change shape. First, it looked like a sailing ship. Then, it became a distant hill. Moments later, it became nothing at all. The wind continued its patient work. Everything changed. Yet everything remained peaceful. The lighthouse stood quietly behind him. Its white walls glowed softly beneath the afternoon sun. The lantern room reflected tiny flashes of golden light. Thomas smiled gently. Another beautiful sky. Another beautiful afternoon. Another ordinary day. Exactly as he liked it. The shadows grew slightly longer across the island. The sun lowered a little closer to the western horizon. Soon, evening would arrive. But for now, there was only the quiet company of the clouds. And for Thomas, that was more than enough.
Sunset across the Atlantic. The afternoon quietly gave way to evening. The sun had begun its slow descent toward the western horizon. Thomas followed the familiar stone path leading back toward the lighthouse. He had walked this path thousands of times. Every small stone, every patch of grass, every weathered wooden fence, all of it had become part of his daily life. The island felt peaceful, even more peaceful than before. The gentle breeze had grown softer. The ocean had become smoother. The clouds above reflected warm shades of gold and amber. Thomas paused beside the lighthouse. The white walls glowed beautifully beneath the evening light. For a brief moment, the lighthouse appeared almost golden. The lantern room reflected the colors of the setting sun. Tiny flashes of orange light danced across the glass. Thomas rested one hand against the weathered stone wall. The surface felt cool, solid, reliable. It had stood against storms for generations, and today, like every other day, it stood quietly beside the sea. Far beyond the cliffs, the Atlantic stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The sunlight created a long golden path across the water. It shimmered gently with every passing wave. Thomas often imagined that path continuing forever, leading somewhere beyond sight, beyond memory, beyond time. He never rushed to watch the sunset. There was no need. The sun always moved at its own gentle pace. Little by little, it drifted lower. The colors around the island slowly changed. Bright blue faded into soft orange. Orange slowly blended into pink. Pink melted gently into lavender. The ocean reflected every color, as if the sea itself wished to remember the evening sky. A pair of seabirds crossed silently above the water. Their wings barely moved. They floated effortlessly upon the evening air. Thomas watched until they disappeared into the distance. The island grew quieter. The breeze slowed. The waves became softer. Even the grass seemed to rest. Only the endless rhythm of the ocean continued. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment. He listened carefully. The waves, the wind, the distant cry of a single gull. Nothing else. No engines, no voices, no hurry. Only peace. When he opened his eyes again, the sun rested just above the horizon. Its light had become gentle, warm, comforting. Thomas smiled softly. Every sunset felt familiar, yet no two sunsets were ever exactly alike. That quiet difference was something he had always appreciated. The final edge of the sun slowly disappeared beneath the distant ocean. The sky remained glowing for several peaceful minutes afterwards. Soft colors lingered above the water. The first evening star quietly appeared high overhead. Thomas took one final look across the Atlantic. Another beautiful day had gently come to an end, and another peaceful evening had begun.
Preparing the evening light. As the final colors of sunset slowly faded from the horizon, Thomas returned to the lighthouse. The familiar wooden door closed gently behind him. Inside, the air felt calm. The thick stone walls held the warmth of the day. Outside, evening quietly settled across the island. Thomas placed one hand upon the smooth wooden railing of the spiral staircase. He had climbed these steps thousands of times. Each step carried memories. Every worn edge had been shaped by years of careful footsteps. Slowly, he began the climb. One step, then another. The lighthouse remained silent.
Only the soft sound of his boots echoed gently upward. Round and round the staircase climbed, past old framed photographs, past shelves holding neatly folded cloths and polished brass tools, past narrow windows where the evening sky slowly darkened. Finally, Thomas reached the lantern room. The room welcomed him with quiet familiarity. Large windows surrounded him on every side. Beyond the glass, the Atlantic Ocean stretched into the deepening blue of evening. The last glow of sunset still rested along the horizon. Thomas walked toward the great lantern. It stood proudly in the center of the room. The polished brass reflected the fading daylight. He paused for a moment, not because there was anything wrong, but because he always believed important work deserved a quiet beginning. He gently placed both hands on the cool metal frame. The lantern had faithfully served countless sailors over many decades, storm after storm, winter after winter, summer after summer. Thomas reached for a soft cotton cloth. With slow and careful movements, he polished the brass. Every curve, every handle, every polished surface. The lantern gradually reflected more and more light. When he finished, he inspected each crystal panel. Crystal clear, spotless, exactly as it should be. Outside, the first stars quietly appeared above the ocean. The island had become almost completely silent. Even the seabirds had found their resting places for the night. Thomas adjusted the lantern's mechanism with practiced hands. Every movement was calm. Every motion was familiar. There was no need to hurry. The lighthouse had always taught him that patience was part of the work. Far below, gentle waves continued meeting the rocky shore. Their steady rhythm reached the lantern room as a soft whisper. Thomas listened for a few moments. The ocean sounded peaceful tonight. Very peaceful. Satisfied, he prepared the lantern for another night of faithful service. Soon, its warm light would once again shine across the dark Atlantic, guiding distant ships, comforting lonely sailors, standing quietly against the darkness, just as it had done for generations. Thomas looked through the great glass windows one last time. The horizon had disappeared into the evening. Only the deep blue sea remained beneath the growing stars. A gentle smile crossed his weathered face. Everything was ready. The lighthouse was ready. The island was ready. And another peaceful night was about to begin.
The last traces of daylight quietly disappeared beyond the western horizon. The island welcomed night with gentle silence. Inside the lantern room, the great lighthouse lamp now shone with a warm golden glow. Its light reflected softly across the polished brass and crystal clear glass. Thomas stood beside it for a long moment. He always enjoyed this quiet transition, the moment when day peacefully handed the island over to the night. Outside the tall windows, darkness slowly settled across the Atlantic Ocean. The sea did not become frightening. It simply became quieter. The waves continued their endless journey toward the shore. Although they could no longer be seen clearly, they could still be heard. Their familiar rhythm filled the night. Thomas looked toward the horizon. Earlier that evening, the sky had glowed with orange and gold. Now it carried deep shades of blue. Above him, countless stars appeared one by one.
Some shone brightly, others were faint and distant. Together they formed a beautiful blanket across the heavens. The lantern room turned slowly. Its powerful beam reached across the dark ocean. Every few moments, its warm light swept across the dark waves, then disappeared, then returned again. Steady, reliable, patient, just as it had done every night for generations. Thomas quietly inspected the lantern once more. Everything worked perfectly. The gears moved smoothly. The glass remained spotless. The gentle hum of the mechanism was almost impossible to hear. He placed his hand lightly against the cool brass frame. It reminded him how many nights this lighthouse had stood watch over the sea. Stormy nights, foggy nights, clear summer nights like this one. Every night had its own quiet story. Tonight's story was one of peace. Outside, the moon slowly climbed higher into the sky. Its pale silver light stretched across the surface of the ocean. The water shimmered softly beneath the stars. Far away, Thomas noticed a tiny point of light moving slowly across the horizon. Perhaps a fishing boat, perhaps a cargo ship. It was impossible to know from this distance. He simply watched it for a while. The small light reminded him that somewhere beyond the darkness, other people were quietly living their own evenings. Families sharing dinner, sailors guiding their ships, travelers crossing the sea. The lighthouse served them all without asking for recognition. It simply shone, night after night, year after year. Thomas appreciated that quiet purpose. There was dignity in doing the same careful work every day, not because someone demanded it, but because it mattered. He walked slowly around the lantern room. Each window revealed a different view of the island. The northern cliffs rested peacefully beneath the moon. The small garden had become a patch of silver and shadow. The narrow walking paths disappeared into the darkness. Everything felt calm. Everything felt familiar. The lighthouse had become a small island of warmth surrounded by the cool blue night. Thomas took one slow breath, then another. He listened. The wind moved gently around the tower. The waves continued their endless rhythm. Somewhere below, a distant seabird made one final call before becoming silent. Nothing else disturbed the night. Thomas smiled softly. Another peaceful evening had arrived. The lantern shone faithfully into the darkness. The sea answered with its endless song, and above them both, the stars continued their silent journey across the sky. The island slept peacefully. The lighthouse remained awake, and Thomas quietly kept watch. Stars above the sea. The night had fully settled across the island. The lighthouse continued its quiet work. Its warm beam swept slowly across the dark Atlantic, then disappeared, then returned once again. Thomas stepped onto the narrow observation balcony just below the lantern room. The cool night air welcomed him gently. He rested one hand against the old iron railing. Below him, the ocean stretched into darkness. Yet it never felt empty. Moonlight painted long silver reflections across the water. Each gentle wave caught the light for only a moment, then quietly released it again. Above him, the sky was clear. Countless stars filled the heavens. Some appeared bright and steady. Others shimmered softly in the distance. Thomas had spent many nights beneath this sky. even after all these years, he never grew tired of looking upward. The stars seemed timeless, patient, silent. They asked for nothing. They hurried nowhere. They simply existed. High above the Atlantic Ocean, a pale ribbon of the Milky Way stretched from one side of the sky to the other. It looked like a gentle river of light flowing across the darkness. Thomas watched quietly. There was no need to name the stars, no need to count them. Simply seeing them was enough. The breeze became cooler as midnight approached. It carried the familiar scent of salt water and clean ocean air. His sweater moved gently with the wind. Far below, the steady rhythm of the waves continued. Each wave arrived, each wave returned. The pattern never changed. It had comforted sailors for centuries. It had comforted lighthouse keepers before Thomas. And tonight, it comforted him once again. A single shooting star crossed the northern sky. It lasted only a second. Then it was gone. Thomas smiled softly. Not because it was rare, but because even brief moments could be beautiful. The lighthouse behind him continued turning with perfect patience. Its warm light crossed the sea in slow circles. Somewhere beyond the horizon, distant ships might be seeing that very light. Perhaps a captain glanced toward it. Perhaps a sailor felt reassured by its steady presence. Thomas would never know. And somehow, that mystery felt peaceful. The island itself had become completely still. The grass no longer moved. The seabirds had long since fallen asleep. Only the ocean and the stars remained. Thomas took a slow breath, then another. The cool air filled his lungs. The silence filled his thoughts. Nothing needed to be fixed. Nothing needed to be finished. The world seemed perfectly content, exactly as it was. He looked once more toward the endless sky. The stars continued their quiet journey. The moon climbed a little higher. The Atlantic whispered below. And the lighthouse stood faithfully between earth and sky. Thomas remained there for several peaceful minutes, simply watching, simply listening, simply being. The night carried him gently into its quiet embrace, and somewhere beyond the horizon, tomorrow was already waiting.
The quiet logbook. The night had grown wonderfully still. Outside, the lighthouse continued its faithful watch over the Atlantic. Inside, Thomas quietly descended from the lantern room. His footsteps echoed gently through the spiral staircase. The old wood beneath his boots had become smooth after generations of careful use. Every step felt familiar. Nothing surprised him here. Nothing ever hurried him. At the bottom of the stairs, a small reading room waited beside the keeper's office. The room was simple. A wooden desk, 2 well-used chairs, a tall bookshelf, a brass oil lamp, a grandfather clock standing quietly in the corner. Thomas lit the lamp. Its warm amber glow slowly filled the room. The light was softer than electricity, gentler, more comforting. He opened the large leather-bound lighthouse logbook. Its pages carried stories written by many keepers before him. Some entries described calm summer evenings, Others mentioned heavy fog rolling across the Atlantic. A few spoke of winter snow covering every stone of the island. Thomas slowly turned another page. The paper felt thick beneath his fingertips. One old entry caught his attention. It had been written more than 60 years earlier. The keeper had simply written, "The sea is peaceful tonight. The lantern shines clearly. All is well." Thomas smiled. Only a few words, yet somehow they said everything. He closed his eyes for a brief moment. The grandfather clock quietly continued its steady rhythm. Tick, tick, tick. Outside, the ocean answered with its own rhythm. Wave, wave, wave. The two sounds blended together. Neither one interrupted the other. They simply existed side by side. Thomas reached for a small brass compass resting upon the desk. Its polished surface reflected the warm lamplight. The needle pointed north as faithfully as it always had. Reliable, steady, unchanging. He gently placed it back where it belonged. Beside it rested an old folded nautical chart. Its edges had softened with age. Countless captains trusted maps much like this one. Thomas unfolded it only slightly. His eyes followed the familiar coastline. Small islands, hidden rocks, safe channels. Places he had known for decades. He carefully folded the chart once again. There was no need to study it tonight. He simply enjoyed knowing it was there. The lamp continued glowing quietly. The lighthouse lantern continued turning high above. The clock continued counting peaceful moments. Outside, the moon climbed a little higher into the night sky. The island slept. Thomas remained awake. Not because he had to, but because someone always had. And tonight, just as on countless nights before, he was content to keep quiet company with the sea. Midnight tea by the window. The lighthouse remained peaceful beneath the quiet stars. Its lantern continued turning with calm and steady purpose. Outside, the Atlantic Ocean whispered against the rocky shoreline. Inside, Thomas walked slowly toward the small kitchen. The room was simple: a wooden table, a single chair, a small iron kettle, shelves holding neatly arranged cups and jars of tea. Nothing more, nothing less. Everything had its place. Thomas filled the kettle with fresh water. He placed it gently upon the small stove. Soon, the quiet sound of warming water filled the room. It was a comforting sound, soft, patient, almost like the ocean itself. While the water slowly heated, Thomas selected his favorite tea, a gentle herbal blend with the light scent of chamomile and mint. He carefully measured the leaves into a small teapot. The kettle began to sing with a soft whistle, never loud, never sharp, only a quiet reminder that the water was ready. Thomas poured the hot water into the teapot. Steam slowly rose into the warm room. The gentle fragrance spread through the air. It mixed with the familiar scent of old wood and clean sea air drifting through a slightly open window. He carried the cup toward the window overlooking the Atlantic. Outside, the moon rested high above the water. Its silver light stretched across the waves like a long ribbon. Thomas wrapped both hands around the warm mug. The heat felt comforting. He took one slow sip. The tea was smooth, warm, peaceful. For several minutes, he simply sat without speaking.
The lighthouse lantern continued its slow rotation. Each sweep of light briefly touched the ocean before disappearing again into the darkness. Then it returned, reliable, faithful, unchanging. Far beyond the horizon, a single distant ship could be seen. Its tiny white light moved almost too slowly to notice. Thomas wondered where it had come from. Perhaps a quiet harbor in Maine, perhaps farther north, perhaps from another coast entirely. He smiled gently. Wherever the ship was going, tonight it would never travel alone. The lighthouse was watching. The ocean was carrying it, and the stars were shining overhead. The grandfather clock quietly marked another passing minute. Tick, tick, tick. Thomas listened carefully. The clock, the waves, the wind. 3 gentle rhythms, each one different, yet together they created perfect harmony. Outside, a faint layer of mist began to form above the water. It drifted slowly across the surface of the Atlantic. The lighthouse beam gently passed through it, turning the mist into soft ribbons of glowing silver. The sight was beautiful, quietly beautiful. Thomas finished the last sip of tea. He placed the empty mug upon the wooden table beside him. The warmth remained in his hands for a little while longer. He looked once more toward the dark horizon. The night still held many peaceful hours. Soon, morning would arrive, but there was no need to think about tomorrow. Tonight was enough. This quiet room, this warm cup of tea, this faithful lighthouse, this endless ocean. Sometimes a peaceful life was built from very small moments, and Thomas knew how to notice every one of them. He closed his eyes for a brief moment. The waves continued, the lantern continued, the stars continued. Everything was exactly where it belonged, and the island rested peacefully beneath the quiet sky.
Another peaceful dawn. The night slowly released its hold upon the island. Far beyond the eastern horizon, the first gentle light of morning quietly appeared. It did not arrive all at once. It never did. Instead, darkness gradually softened. The deep blue sky became pale. The stars slowly disappeared, one by one. Only a few remained for a little while longer. The Atlantic Ocean welcomed the coming day with the same steady rhythm it had carried through the night. Wave after wave reached the rocky shore. Wave after wave returned to the sea. Nothing had changed, and somehow that brought comfort. Inside the lighthouse, the great lantern completed another faithful night of service. Its warm light slowly faded as daylight grew stronger. Thomas climbed the final steps toward the lantern room. He looked once more across the ocean. The sunrise painted the horizon with gentle colors: soft gold, pale orange, hints of pink. The sea reflected every shade. For a long moment, Thomas simply watched. He did not think about yesterday. He did not worry about tomorrow. He allowed this quiet morning to be exactly what it was: a new beginning. Fresh air entered through the open window. It carried the scent of salt, wild grass, and distant flowers still wet with morning dew. Thomas smiled gently. Another peaceful day had arrived. He descended the spiral staircase. Outside, tiny drops of dew rested on every blade of grass.
The island looked fresh, almost new. A pair of seabirds lifted into the morning sky. Their wings caught the first rays of sunlight. They circled the lighthouse once, then disappeared toward the open sea. Thomas followed the familiar path toward the cliffs, the same path he had walked countless times before, yet it never felt old. Every sunrise offered something slightly different, a different cloud, a different breeze, a different reflection upon the water. The island did not need excitement. It needed only time, patience, and quiet attention. Thomas paused beside the old wooden bench. The ocean stretched endlessly before him. The lighthouse stood quietly behind him, its white walls now bright beneath the morning sun. The small garden sparkled with dew. The flowers slowly opened to greet the day. Everything was exactly where it belonged. The waves continued. The wind continued. The lighthouse continued. And Thomas continued. Not because life demanded anything extraordinary, but because ordinary days lived with care could become extraordinary in their own quiet way. He took one final slow breath. The morning air filled his lungs. The sound of the sea filled the silence. The rising sun warmed the cool stone beneath his feet. Another day had begun. Another peaceful chapter had quietly opened. And somewhere beyond the endless horizon, another traveler might notice the lighthouse, not knowing the keeper's name, not knowing his story, only knowing that its light had always been there, steady, patient, faithful. Thomas looked toward the ocean one last time. Then he quietly turned toward the lighthouse. There was gentle work to do, simple routines to follow, small moments to appreciate. The island would awaken. The sea would continue. The sky would change. And tomorrow another peaceful dawn would arrive, just as it always had, just as it always would.